I start with Josephine Balmer on this side, a poet, classical translator, research scholar, and literary critic. Her published works include the translation Sappho, Poems and Fragments, and Classical Women Poets. Her most recent volume, Things We Leave Behind, Selected Poems, was named one of the Observer Best Poetry Books of 2025. In the middle, Ulrike Draesner, a freelance writer living in Berlin and in Leipzig, where she has been director of the German Literature Institute since 2018. She has received many awards, most recently the Grand Prize of the German Literature Fund in 2021 and the Literature Prize of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in 2024, along with the Gisela Elsner Literature Prize and the Christine Lavant Prize for that work, which exactly, thank you very much, Ulrike, which was published in German by Penguin in 2025. I hesitate to read out the title because this is one of the things that, you know, how do you read out a title where you do not have enough vowels to work with? So we will hear all about that in the course of this event. And Karen Leeder is a writer, translator, and Schwarz-Taylor Chair of German Language and Literature here at the University of Oxford. She teaches and publishes, especially on modern and contemporary poetry, and is currently PI on the project After Words with an Einstein Visiting Fellowship at the Free University in Berlin. So as far as the format is concerned, what we were thinking was to start with readings from the work of Josephine Balmer and Ulrike Draesner. And then we want to move to a conversation that involves the two of them and Karen Leeder. And finally, we want to open this discussion to questions and contributions from the audience, both in person and online. So I will hand over to Karen, who will take us through the rest of this event. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think we'll, with no further ado, we'll start with some reading. Jo, would you like to take the...
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, smashing. Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Paschalis and the archive for inviting me this afternoon. It's always a huge pleasure to come and speak here. And good afternoon and hello to everyone in the room and also to everyone joining us online. Now, in preparation for today, I've been thinking about how, as women poets and translators, there are many different ways in which we can revoice or recover ancient texts. Firstly, we can rewrite iconic works of the canon, transforming or even transgressing them, giving their often silent or passive female protagonists their own narrative and agency, as in Ulrike's wonderful work. We can also subvert the male narrative, ventriloquizing heroic or epic verse and overlaying them with our own sometimes very personal purposes. And finally, we can also excavate the forgotten voices or unknown stories of everyday women in the ancient world, the sort of stories that we don't usually get to hear. Now, hopefully I'll be covering all aspects of these this afternoon in my reading. And I'm going to be reading, as Karen says, from my new volume, which you can see here, Things We Leave Behind, Selected Poems. And this was edited by Paschalis Nikolaou, who I'm very pleased to say is joining us remotely from Corfu this afternoon. And the first poem that I'd like to read is from my debut collection, Chasing Catullus, in 2004. And it falls into the first category I mentioned. Its mythical woman protagonist, Philomela, has been silenced in the most violent of ways. Her tongue is cut out by her brother-in-law Tereus, so she cannot reveal that he raped her. Instead, Philomela depicts her ordeal in a tapestry. As we see in Penelope's story, this is a very important woman's craft in the ancient world. And she then sends this to her sister Procne, Tereus's wife. And in response, Procne kills their son, Itys, murders him, and serves up his flesh to Itys at a feast. Now, it's one of the most stomach-churning myths, I think, of all time, most famously retold by Ovid in Metamorphoses. Now, in writing the poem, clearly my first thought is for all of us who have been subjected to rape and sexual assault, and how, like Philomela, we might not be able to articulate that experience. You can see it here on the slide. Philomela. One way or another, I'd have done it myself. Let grief, guilt, or prick-sharp shame wear down my tongue to a bloody stump, slit my own throat, sliced off my lips, in case my traitor's speech should shape that place again. So now I weave my words with crimson thread, pick out my stunted songs in sacking chords, the music of the deaf, the music of the dead. And my sole phrase at the plan I start to trace, homes blocked in by sex and strife and sword, the husband dropped, wife I'll never make. And my heart knots at the thought of kids. They seem too soft, too sweet, too pure to stitch. So the end of the poem brings us on to another preoccupation of Chase and Catullus, the death of the child. It's the last poem of the first section and leads into the collection's next central section, which is written in diary form. And it narrates the progress of a devastating family tragedy, the death of my sister's young daughter from cancer at the age of 7. And when we think about the loss of the child in an ancient world, the archetypal classical myth that probably springs to mind is that of the corn goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone, or in Latin, Proserpina, who was stolen away, as we all know, by Hades, god of the underworld. And it's a story that's been told and retold so many times throughout the classical world and indeed throughout world literature. But one of my favourite renderings is perhaps one of the more obscure, from Claudian's late Latin epic poem De Raptu Proserpinae, which was written at the very end of the Roman Empire in 400 CE or thereabouts. So for my poem in Chasing Catullus, I followed Claudian's Latin quite closely, sort of like opaque tracing paper laid over the original. And as you'll see, it wasn't really necessary to add any further exposition beyond a new contextualization, a date and a time. De Raptu Proserpinae, 2nd of the 8th, 6:47 AM. Now she came to the hills, wound round and round in grass. At first light, she picked her flowers. The earth shivered with dew. Violets slaked their newborn thirst. But as the sun advanced on its high noon sky, night fell like a thief, and our land trembled to the touch, trampled, dust-blown, under 4 sets of cloven hooves. Their horseman we didn't know, harbinger, camp follower, or even death himself. But now our soft meadows bruised, rivers stopped mid-flow, fields rusted like forgotten ploughs. To breathe with suicide, trees drained of green. Roses shed their petals, lilies shriveled before our eyes. And then he turned away, swinging round the reins like the gates of hell, grating to a close. Night scuttled after, as the light seeped back into our black world. Everywhere was light, sun and sky and light, and your small daughter nowhere to be seen. Now we can see here how I found that one of the ways in which I could write out of my grief to say the unsayable was through the prism of classical texts, what Ezra Pound calls personae or masks. And paradoxically, I think the use of Claudian's male authorial voice here helped me to articulate that shock of loss by placing a distance of gender as well as of time and space. I'd like to move on now to another very different poem from Chasing Catullus. This was commissioned for the journal's Perversions, I think way back in about 1999, 2000. And Fresh Meat was inspired by a textual interpolation in Homer 22. That is a later addition by a scribe or copyist, which in itself is sort of like an early form of a transgressional version. Now here, as the Greek warrior Achilles and the Trojan champion Hector face each other in mortal combat after Hector has killed Achilles' beloved Patroclus, Hector wonders whether to sue for peace. But in the interpolated text, he realizes the two were not, quote, young lovers exchanging confidences, and concludes that Achilles would kill him where he stood, quote, naked like a woman. Now, returning to the scene, I was immediately struck by the sort of subtext of desire here between the two warriors, which turns traditional readings of the scene inside out. It's a long poem, so I'm just going to read an extract for you today. In Fresh Meat, a perversion of Iliad 22. But by then, I would have taken Lord Achilles in my arms, stripped the bronze from his oiled body to whisper in his ear, forget Helen, forget your dark ships lying at anchor in my deep seas. Forget this grey city, which will haunt us for all time. Its ghosts are old already, and we're too young, far too young, to tread their ashen paths. But we were warriors, not lovers lying side by side in hazy summer fields, talking out our lives as dandelion or parsley seed drifted down in search of former flower. And I knew he would have killed me where I stood, naked and trembling, trapped like a woman when I had shed the armour from my skin. Us, after Patroclus, there could be no forgetting and no forgiveness, no friendship, no faith, no trysts, no trust, until we had slaked our bloodlust, repaid with increased interest the high-rate sorrow of love long lost. As he raised his spear, I saw at once the evening star caught above the coves where I had fished as a boy. That first shaft of light falling on the mackerel, scaled and gutted in our boats, floating down the waters like a sail unfurled from a black, black ship. And I watched him as he scoured my skin for that one soft spot where the flesh might best be pierced, as he found it on my neck between jugular and windpipe, and then drove home the point, leaving me just breath enough to beg for more. Now, here I was interested in transgressing, in perverting the male classical canon, both as a poet and a woman, departing from the standard orthodoxy that this was a scene reflecting the male military ethos of the poem. And I was particularly fascinated by Hector's statement that he felt like a woman. So I inverted the process by which Sappho and other women lyric poets had plundered Homer for images and epithets for their erotic verse. Instead of taking the language of war and placing it in the context of love, as Sappho had done, I wanted to take the language of love and place it in the context of war. Okay, I'd like to move on now to my 2017 sonnet sequence, Letting Go, which was again written in response to a family bereavement. Here, the sudden death of my mother from a heart attack. And again, I drew inspiration and comfort from classical texts. Now, the following poem is from later on in the sequence, when raw grief is settling down into a sort of acceptance. Its first 8 lines are based on Odyssey Book 9, where after being rescued by the Phaeacians, Odysseus speaks of his longing for his homeland Ithaca. But in my poem, Odysseus' Ithaca is very, very soon relocated to West Cornwall, my family home. The seat in the poem is on the coastal footpath between Marazion and Perranuthnoe, overlooking Mount Spey. I was just along from my grandfather's house, so it's been a family favourite for several generations and still is. Seat. Even from the bench, The bay is undimmed. Beyond hazy blackthorn, the mount quivers as its pine trees tilt, reeled back by the wind. The marker that tells us we're really here, at the far point, lying low, facing west. Below, rocks snag across the land on loan from the turning tide, shrunk into darkness. Nothing soothes the soul like the sight of home. This one rears daughters fierce as fighting men. Here's where you rested with your own mother, watching swifts dip, dissect the setting sun, by paths picked out in self-heal and clover. Blood and bone pack the sacred ground beneath. Your place, my longed-for Ithaca, our seat. Now here we start with Odysseus's voice, his POV, which is rapidly transformed into my own. And again, the transgression here, as in so much of classical women's poetry, is of a woman's world of family and domestic life being substituted for the warrior's war of war and possession. Here, Ithaca belongs to us. The seat, a word used of a palace, a place of power, is now our dominion. My next poem stays with the Odyssey and is from a new sequence of poems, Archaeology of Home, based on the experience of caring for my father as he slowly faded away with vascular dementia. It's inspired by passages from Odyssey 24, in which Odysseus, after an absence of 20 years, is finally reunited with his father Laertes. Now, Laertes isn't usually characterized as having dementia. When I went back to the passage, the way he seems so unsure in recognizing his son and the way he repeats the questions he asks of him over again seemed to me to evoke it. So I followed this new reading in my poem. And I also really liked the way that Homer's description of Laertes' garden matched that of our family house. And again, Odysseus' voice becomes my own, transgendered. Odysseus and Laertes. As if a stranger, he stared right through me. I found him in the garden, dug in, filthy, his shins patched against scuff or scratch, tattered gloves for thorn guard, his old straw hat. Who are you? He asked. How did you get here? Confused, he needed proof, signs to be sure. I showed him the scar of a dog bite wound. I numbered the trees he had walked me through as a pestering child. Cypress, low enough then to leapfrog, now taller than the house. Crabapple for shade, figs, fig bushes, the yew where I had made my camp, hedges he'd grown to keep the world out and us in. He smiled like buds, surprised by early spring. I'd like to end now with a poem from my last full-length collection, 2022's Ghost Passage. Now, rather than high literary works like Homer or Ovid or whatever, the collection took inspiration from non-literary fragments, such as inscribed household objects, many of which have been excavated from Roman London and beyond. So the following poem, I'm just going to show it to you here on the slide, is inspired by a tiny Roman writing stylus excavated from what would have been the old Walbrook stream in the city of London. Now, it's a very, very unusual artifact because each of its four sides is scratched with a minuscule inscription, and it's actually an inscription of verse. It makes a little ditty, and you can see it here on the screen. Now, the city referred to is Rome, and the gist of it seems to be the ancient equivalent of I went to Rome and all I got to was this lousy pen. But when writing the poem inspired by it, the voice that came to me was that of the gift giver, a young woman with her own reasons to feel aggrieved, an ordinary female voice, an everyday story, which in the worlds of goddesses and mythological heroines, we don't often get to hear. Keepsake. From Rome, a keepsake to bring you pleasure, a pointed gift, so you will always remember. I wish I could have given you much, much more, but the journey is long and funds are short. I'm sure he threw it in the stream. London, I had heard, was in ferment, packed with pleasure. Fine wines, sweet ale, and most of all, women. its frost-edged dusk a lure to warm the bones. My message, sharpened in miniature, would go unread, unmarked. He didn't know there was a further present still to come from that brief jasmine night he'd forgotten. Those paired hours we shared before he'd embarked, what I relived by day. How the moon grazed the seared ostia like a polished blade, as each serrated kiss cut time in half. A keepsake to bring you pleasure, 10 days old, a father in replica, as sharp. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm very glad, thank you. And you came, and I'm very glad to be here. Is it on? Everything all right? Yeah, almost. I'm just going to read the beginning of this book, Penelope's If. This is one way of pronouncing it. There's all these funny brackets here. Talk about it later, perhaps. You can see them here. Again, that is the title as translated by Karen. I'm going to read the beginning in German, only a couple of pages, and then Karen will continue to read her translation, and you will be able to follow it on the slides all the time in English. There are some commas. We'll talk about that later on as well. In Neuko zu Hause sein. In den Saugnäpfen der Kraken, die man aus den salzüberspülten Höhlen am Hafen zieht, hängen Stücke von Fels, so kräftig klammern sie an. Einem Polypen gleich muss man den faulen Kerl aus Kirkes Schweinehöhle zerren, wo er sich hätscheln lässt, ganz Helene, ganz Hormon, statt den Acker zu pflügen, seine Herrschaft, den Eukos, zu bestellen. Laut schimpft Antikleia aus dem ersten Stock des Palas, wo sie, schwarze Krähe, zwischen den Schirmkronen der Pinien die Straße bewacht, um ihn, Utis, den kurzen Sohn, dessen Kosename niemand bedeutet, als ersten zu greifen, während sie, Penelope, die Fremde, sie weiß doch, wie die Schwiegermama über sie denkt, sie, das zarte Mädchen einst, die muskelgeschmeidige Spartanerin nun, jeden Morgen nackt und glänzend wie junges Olivenöl im Hof, unter aller Augen. Komm schon, Antikleia, geh auch freier schauen. Mit ihren Frauen ringt und in die Weite wirft den Ball wie den Blick. Eine große, fliederfarbene Leere wühlt in der See. Opa Laertes, ausgezogen, bestellt, was Garten er nennt, einen Stundenlauf wild, sein bergiges Reich. Jeder schmollt auf seine Weise, in Briefen erzählt er Mythos, Polyphem, Philopheme, wie sie, Penelope, wartet und wartet auf seinen Sohn, womit er sich das eigene Sehnen verkleidet, seine in die Wurzeln des Gartens gepflügte Machtlosigkeit, so dass die Welt nun glaubt, sie, in deren Augengrund der Morgenröte Finger spielt, nähte Kleidung, sie, die in Menschen näht. Ihr Haus blüht. Elopeia, Elechos. Briefe und Karten, zahllos, sendet Helena Hühnchenhals zurück Hause in Sparte, über Glaukopis, eulaugig, dem schimmernden Meer, klingt wieder Ithakas Hof vom Dotzen des Balls, ihre Mägde geübt, Mägde, widersinniges Wort, ihre Frauen, ihre Tarnung, ihr Schild.
When the wind swept in from Aulis, sharp, still smoky across the land, split the laurel buds, drove the hyacinths green from the earth, she sat, the poet down in the kitchen, with raw dough he shapes female bodies for himself, presses raisins in, moi enepe musa, tell me, raisin, of the many-turned man. She laughs, oitis, polyptropos, Odysseus, polyamorous, the most notorious kraken in the Aegean, while she, since Cassandra, her aunt from Troy, wore a strophion of golden jackal fur across her breast. Before Mycenae's murderous gate, sold pelt after pelt of the carnivore hunters to Athens, Anatolia, Egypt, into the world in every direction. Lo, li, love, lie, oh my. When red-black from the depth of the sea licks the island sands, at night she too joins in the hunt between the bearers of nets in the swaying lantern light, where owls and bats roam like finely woven cloths through the crunching forest of needles and acorns of Athos to capture the pelted creatures without injury, only in winter, not when the vixens yellow as bees bring up food before the blind eyes of their young ones, bristling golden pelt. They snatch one of the yelping young from every den, just one, not always the strongest, to create a community. She who always thinks in humans, she who knows how to sew people together, knows how she must feed them. The wild jackals are almost already tame. They have built cages like those for the mice on which they will live once on the ship, the deep, scurrying field of the journey. Also packed the fine needles of bone, the threads spun by worms from the east, the wool spliced for basic work, the thread for tissue to fix fat, muscle, and tendon, to make whole what splits open after injury, what gapes after any birth. 400 swine kept by Eumaeus in winter in narrow stalls. He calls women for aid when the sows bite their own tails or the piglets get stuck in the birth canal. So they have learned to help and learned to hem, leap, creeping sideways, lycriphos, like the crab too in the healing seam. The stinking goats graze free in the meadow, walls secure, the shepherd's stead at the edge of the isle, eschatos. Beneath the high cliff face, known as Corax, where Pharmaxa, yarrow, poppy, they harvest moly, Ithaca's modal lily leap, the bulb black, ground in the depths, milky the flower, dosed with honey. They rub it on lips, rub numbness round the injured mouth. She who knows the mother-in-law stitch, one loop to the front, not two back, or the Hector stitch, all on neck, vertebrae, face. She who knows how to close skin of almost nothing, grape skin. All these will be chosen for the crew. Unctuous oil drips from chained linen without a sound. She too has left a home behind, the rose-coloured plush of regard, unquenchable thirst. No one gone for years comes back as the one he was. The task that Otis passed on to her is fulfilled if he comes. She is free to stay, so as to remain. Who she has become, penelope, dips the eyelash wreath, the oar in the water. From the window, the clasp leaps across the sea. This skin, bright red from thinking, can contain no pick. Thank you. It was fascinating listening to you both introduce what you were going to read. It kind of prompted me to sort of go in lots of different directions, but I have some questions and I'll kind of weave in some of your comments. First, I mean, we have here two people who move between the academy, academic work, translation, and then their own creative work. So sort of 6 for the price of 2, as it were. And it seemed to me that I kind of wanted to explore the relationships between those things. Joe, you talked about your work being fueled by scholarship in the rather marvellous introduction, actually, to this work. It's quoted there. And you also have all these figures in some of your poems of sort of custodians and remakers and students and scholars and teachers and annotators, you mentioned, and copyists. And Ulrike, in your introduction, you talk specifically about Mary Beard and Emily Wilson as inspirations. And so I'm kind of keen to tease out the relationship between, you know, the academic, the scholarly approach to these things, and then the creative.
Yeah, well, for me, I think it comes from being a translator first, because the sort of text that I was working on, the fragmentary text, I mean, it just couldn't possibly work on without scholarship, because I didn't have that sort of textual scholarship skills. I didn't have the philological skills or whatever. So it's absolutely necessary to go back to the scholarship and put that work in. And what I found was that just what might seem like a completely dry comment from a scholar would inspire me in the translation and give me sort of a way to go. And I think when I moved on to writing my own poetry, and I was obviously doing it at the same time as well, I followed it with that process. And I often found that, you know, I would be nose deep in articles, which might, again, seem very, very unpoetic. But to me, they gave me lots of inspiration. So just one example, the lousy pen from Rome. I mean, that's from Roger Tomlin, the really, really great Roman Britain scholar. I mean, I couldn't possibly read a cursive script Roman Britain writing tablet. I just don't have those skills. And I think he's about the only person in the country who does have those skills. And so his article on it, just, you know, something clicked when I read it. And then this voice of this young woman came to me. So it's very much a kind of symbiotic relationship, I suppose.
Yeah. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, absolutely. I would like to take you up on that because academic research and deciphering out manuscripts, thinking about the interpretation of texts, this is not only useful for other academics, it's just a very important form of knowledge given to a society, and within the society it becomes active, and it might trigger, as it does in our cases, artistic responses, and we're not the only ones, of course, just the examples. So I think for me, my interest in the bridge, or in going to and fro, is really in the background an interest in forms of knowledge. What kinds of knowledge do we have? What knowledge or what kind of shape or profile of knowledge is only achievable by a poem, but you need to feed in a different kind of knowledge, which fortunately enough, there are other people who provide you with that because you couldn't possibly do all of this on your own. And I would like to expand that onto another point which you made a couple of times in your reading. There was always kind of this combination of there is a personal history and a personal story to a question, a life question, things which concern our daily lives today, like loss of people, or in my case, the role of women, the kind of lingering on of a patriarchal system. And then you combine that with the knowledge created by some other people and relate back to the past in order to connect back our lives to that past and to draw on the wealth of tradition, of various forms of knowledge. So it is really, and then it goes back, if people start to interpret the poems, then it goes back into the kind of academic area of knowledge. And I've been, you know, this is, I think it's coming up in Germany now. It's probably been here for quite a long time as well. You have this kind of new interest in artistic research and what that would be and why you would need it and how you really kind of combine or weave a thread in order to be more in the metaphoric use of the Penelope, weave a thread between these different realms.
I mean, when I remember I came here and I read from the Paths of Survival, I didn't even know whether it was published then. And someone, an academic in the audience, said to me, put their hand up at the end and said, "Why have you written this as poetry rather than scholarship?" Which was, you know, such a good question, actually. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, actually, because poetry can actually present two truths at the same time. It can present, you know, conflicting ideas, whereas scholarship will be presenting you just with I suppose on one level. So I think that was why I did it.
I'm going to stand up for scholars here and say we work on multi-levels too, but I'm also interested in so Jo, you talked about the classical material also as something which allowed you to talk about things which you couldn't have, you know, to say the unsayable. It's so a sort of arm's length approach, or a kind of, I mean, a way to avoid the confessional, or responding, repairing, Ulrike, in your work. There's often, we did an event in Germany just last month, and Ulrike had written a response to Rilke's famous poem about the panther in a cage, but she dug a postcard from 1905 that showed it was La Panthère, so a female panther. So she wrote back, so she, you know, wrote back to the original. So I'm sort of interested then. You mentioned comfort too, so grief, comfort, the confessional, that there is a particular way that this material intervenes, isn't it, in the experience of the poem?
I think, yeah, there are several points. And by the way, I do think that scholarship is amazing.
I know.
And there's a lot of
really amazing. It's all right.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of issues here on there. I mean, as I say, it's a way to say the unsayable. It's a way into something that you really want to approach, but you can't. So, I mean, and obviously for me, as I've been trained as a classicist, then classical literature, classical texts are like my vocabulary, they're my language. So that's the way that I can find, I say, my way into these awful tragedies. But I think also it moves your experience, whether it's a tragedy, whatever it is, from being personal to universal. And I think that's one of the, you know, the most amazing things about classical literature, because it has this huge long history, it's so monolithic, that it's giving a sort of gravitas to that experience. And at the same time, your poem or your work of art or whatever is moving the classical world on as well, because you know you're putting a Sappho fragment in a poem or whatever, giving them a new kind of context. So there's I think there's a two-way relationship going on.
Absolutely, d'accord. But I think for me, my motivation, my personal motivation for finally doing the Penelope was slightly different. It started in a different place. You mentioned that I mentioned Mary Beard, and it was a talk in the internet about women in power, and it came later as a book, as you probably all of you know it. He started that talk by presenting a map from the kind of warfare, I almost said, from the first, was it the first, when Trump stood for election in 2016 against Clinton. And so the MAGA, they had produced various items for advertising Trump. And one of these items was this mug. And on the mug, there was Trump presenting himself as Perseus, dressed up as a Perseus, but it was all Trump with all his fat breasts and so on. And there he was. I have to repost that. And he stood, like, here the sword, proud warrior, arm outstretched, holding Medusa's head in his hand, or the icons, what it looks like, hair, face, blood dripping from the neck. And the face was Hillary Clinton's face. And that really shocked me. Because this obviously, in 2016, was very obvious and still much more shocking than today because we've become so used to it. But this wasn't democratic discourse any longer. And it also made so clear to me how deeply woven into our cultural memory, our cultural codes, the antique myth are. Mm-hmm. Because quite obviously, a MAGA word doesn't address scholars primarily. So, and Trump would choose that because he would think that this would be effective in addressing a great amount of people, of men perhaps primarily, I don't know. And I had been thinking about Penelope for a long time, till about the age of 10, because my mother wanted to present her as a kind of role model to me. And I thought Ulysses was so much more interesting. This was obviously the person to be, and not to be a dull wife at home all the time, being bored and sad and crying for 20 years. And, having this kind of wonderful metaphor for care work with you, like it's a metaphor in the book. It's quite concrete. It's everything you do during the day kind of magically dissolves overnight. This is care work, obviously. So I thought, fine to do it, but this shouldn't be my entire life. So and seeing the mark really kind of finally gave me the last push to really try to learn ancient Greek and write the poem. And so what I really want to say, there is such a political dimension to these old stories. They have been reiterated for 2,000 years now through our cultures, Western cultures at least. And so if you add yourself to the many voices who started to retell these voices, you really kind of continue a long cultural dialogue. It's never only been about the past, or even mainly been about the past. It's always been about how do we understand our present and how do we visualize our futures. So that is how do we visualize like gender concept, roles, warfare. And this book turned out to be, so that's where I started, and then in the writing, it became clear to me it's a book about war. About the sacrifices and the costs of war to everybody, not only to the warriors and soldiers who are being slain or wounded, but really to everybody, to a society in its entirety. And then Putin invaded Ukraine, and it all became so topical that I was really overwhelmed by that and tried to do my best to finish it.
I mean, so in both of the works, it seems to me, both of you, there's the personal, and there's that personal moment that you talked about, Jo. But also both works do layer history upon history. And you also talk about war, for example. So you see you see these as contributions to a sort of ongoing commentary about politics of now.
Yeah. As I was saying to you earlier, Karen, I mean, in my forthcoming collection, I've got a whole section in which I've taken passages from Herodotus, Thucydides, who else? Tacitus, describing kind of horrific acts of war, and I'm sort of placing them in the context of what's been going on recently in our world. And I think, again, that is a way of getting to the horror, which is palatable for the reader as well as for the writer. But you can make a very sort of strong point that way, because everybody knows the story of the Peloponnesian War, they know the story of the Persian Wars.
And without sort of steering the present sort of head on,
Yeah.
you kind of approach it from an
Yeah.
angle that can throw up all these kind of, well, prism was the word you used very early on in what you
Yeah.
were talking, and I was thinking prisms really, yeah.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the light's going in all sorts of directions as it passes through.
Let's talk about the Odyssey, because both you took a bit of the Odyssey from your when you were reading, Jo, and this is a sort of take on a kind of rewriting. Let me put it like that simply. Ulrike says in talking about this book, how can you approach, the most important myth of the cultural history of the Western lands? How can you meet it? And the answer is, put it in a glass of pickles. It's got to be transported. And I suppose my question to both of you is, what is it that's special about approaching kind of Homer, in inverted commas, Homer, and this story that, and of course, many people have done it before, and particularly in the English language context. There are a couple of notable German attempts to sort of deal with it, but it's got such a rich history. Think of Anne Carson or Margaret Atwood, or there are so many. Derek Walcott. There are these fantastic rewritings. So, what is it about this material and the particular approaches that are available today?
Good question. I think it needs a prismatic answer. There are many reasons combining, especially in the Anglo-American realm. I think there has been this revived interest in texts from the antiquity. There's been very, very good scholars and marvelous works of art. It's different in Germany. But I think partly we go back to these roots because they are the roots of our culture, and because we have a lot of intercultural identities coming up, a lot of questions concerning identity and cultural identity. So it might be worthwhile looking back to what do we call the foundations of our culture? How valuable, how strong are they, and what might we be able to discover there, which we have overlooked for good reasons or have been made to overlook over centuries. That's one way. The other way for me, I use it because looking back, it's like a tool, because the first thing I stumble across is the translations, which were done in the 19th century, basically, and some in the 20th already. And so since I'm not a scholar of the classic languages, this was how I got to know the Homer, in quotation marks. And that's where I went back first. And I just had the feeling, I directly look into the face of the 19th century, even in the translations made toward the end of the 20th century. There's this very, very kind of useless German translation of the slaves, the female slaves, as Mägde, which are, people employed in the house. It obviously aren't slaves, but they just didn't want to speak out that the ancient Greek held slave. So you kind of strip there is no original, you strip the translations from all the add-ons put on by the past, their most recent past, and their cultural, moral, and so on values. And then you start to ask yourself, I was weaned in postmodern times, and I've heard so much about narratives, and I've learned to believe that we tell each other a lot of narratives, and obviously they are linked to power. So you ask yourself, what kind of profile of power, of suppression, of posing or posing to the throne can I discover in these old texts in order to better understand the, in my case, patriarchal society, which kind of which still surrounds me, and I feel the effects on my life. I felt them for my life, so they're still there. I want to understand how it came about and how, during the centuries, from translation to translation in German, this image was, or this building was built and strengthened. So I go back, and that's why I thought I needed to learn some ancient Greek in order to really go back to the original, to get a feeling for it, and to see what could possibly be my very contemporary contribution to one amongst the many other explications or translations of this particular work. And I think go back to Homer in this case, because I always loved Odysseus, because it's widely spread. I don't know about England, but in Germany, most people wouldn't know anything any longer about antique texts or myth. The only thing which really kind of sticks seems to be the story of the Cyclops. Everybody seems to know that, you know, and some children read like the basic legends of, and then it's Odysseus and perhaps Achilles. So this is one of the last small remaining reference points within the canon, which has been shrinking for decades now as well. So pick out this in order to really to still be open to relate to others and make them relate to the text, which the respinning of the narrative which you develop.
I mean, Jo, you translate or version or, you know, take inspiration from lots of different writers. Is there something special about Homer in the way that Ulrike was talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a couple of things to pick up on. I mean, Susan Besant made the point that we used to have the Bible as our foundation text, and we don't anymore. And it almost the Iliad, but particularly the Odyssey, has sort of taken over as our foundation text, you know, in a sort of secular way. I also think that for women in particular, there's quite a lot more for us in the Odyssey than, say, in the Iliad or Gilgamesh or other, you know, although obviously the hero is Odysseus and Penelope is very massive. There are some very, very vividly drawn women there. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're drawn to it. I was very interested, I mean, I was reading Ulrike's introduction to Penelope, in your translation of it. And you were saying, Ulrike, that, you know, you had a book of ancient myths as a child, and I had tales of Ulysses. I remember getting it one Christmas, you know, and I was really, really thrilled with it. So right from a very early age, this is the sort of text that you go back to. And I sort of saw, because my dad used to take me to see James Bond films, even though, you know, I probably wasn't allowed to because of the ratings, but he still did. And so Odysseus seemed to me like James Bond, you know, he went and had all these amazing adventures, and that was who we identified with. We wanted to be that character. So in a way, I think it's very, very understandable that that's the text that we go back to. And there's also the sense of, you know, you were talking about Germany after the war. And, you know, obviously the Odyssey was the first Penguin classic. It came out after the war, and it had this incredible resonance, didn't it, for everybody coming back in 1945 from the war. I mean, and I remember bombed outsides and being taken to Coventry Cathedral when it was reopened and all this. And so I think it has that resonance as well for those of us of our generation, perhaps.
It's interesting what you said, because it makes it so clear, I think, that Odysseus, he is such a relatable character.
Yeah.
Because he is one of the very few heroes who are not just only made up of muscle and strength. And I always found, you know, all these stories about Heracles, they were so boring.
Yes,
he would always succeed and be strong, and really boring if you have to remove the rubbish of swine or so on. I knew that from my Bavarian relatives, and I knew how it smelled. It was really, really too dull. Whereas Ulysses, he was such a nice anti-hero.
Yeah.
He didn't want to go to war. And then he has, you know, his muscles are in his brain.
Yeah.
And this is something I felt as being a girl I could really relate
Yeah,
to.
me too. Definitely.
Yeah. And because you mentioned Gilgamesh, that's fine. I mean, the females there, they're just goddesses.
Yes.
And in a way, intangible. They know all and do all and manipulate all, and it's so true, because I found that when I wrote the Penelope, there is a chapter where Anticlea, you know, she raises her voice. She's really pissed with his son.
Yes, off we say.
And he decides to leave as well, yeah, because he's not been behaving in a kind of useful way or responsible way.
Yeah.
And I want to add something. I would like to ask you something, because when you said Laertes, he's never called it's never said that he will have dementia But when you said it, it made so much sense to me, because I always wondered, how is this? He was the king and his son leaves, and there's a very, very young woman called Penelope.
Yes, what's she doing in charge?
Yes, why is she in charge all of a sudden
exactly.
for 20 years? So what's wrong with him? And why does he live in this garden?
Yes.
And so this really makes sense.
Yeah.
And so what you see, what always fascinated me is, what can you do in understanding these old texts, in doing something actually which at university in Munich I was forbidden to do, because they all has to be historical. But I always found it fascinating to take our vocabulary, our ideas of how we explain psyche, and when we call about post-traumatic distress order, something like that, to take these concepts and to make them meet the old texts and see what kind of knowledge, feeling, insights really spring from that. Because this really also helps to bridge the gap of the 2000 years. And all of a sudden, the characters in the books, they really come alive. And basically the answer to why go back to Homer, because he's so good.
That would be a very good place to stop, actually. But I'm going to ask you perhaps one more question, and then we'll open to the audience. That answer actually set up for it very nicely, which is about form, actually. So Ulrike writes in her introduction, about shifting or the sort of hexameter, using the hexameter, but underlaying it, with the English is interfering, the pentameter is interfering. And of course, there's a lot being written about, what you do with the hexameter. I translate quite a lot of German poetry that's written in hexameters into English, and we breathe pentameter, we use pentameter, and so it's always a problem. What do you do? And I'm interested, Jo, in how you integrate, because you do integrate lines from the classical text into your work, and where do you go with the rhythm in that sense? So Ulrike, it sort of became clear, also uses bits of Greek in the text, and sort of kind of radical shapes. I was making a bit of a mess of reading the suture in the English there. I didn't really know what to do with it. And so there's this sort of formal question about what we do and how we take up things. Jo, do you have a particular approach, or do you just go with the fragments and see where it leads you?
I tend to go with the poem and see where it leads me. So very often I end up writing a sonnet, because I really like to write in a very, very constricted form, because I feel that if you're writing something very emotional, that puts a lid on it. So it doesn't get, so actually the form itself acts as a sort of break for sort of getting too emotional, getting too far away from what you're trying to say. So yeah, I tend to go pentameter, obviously. Sometimes, it really just depends on how the first lines come to you, and then from then, you go on. I don't worry too much about saying, I've got to replicate classical verse in English, because I don't think it's possible. I mean, wasn't it Abraham Cowley said of Pindar, it would feel like one madman was translating another if you try to copy Pindar's metrics, and I kind of feel that's a very good lesson in life.
Well, Hölderlin was considered mad, but Pindar, exactly. So be careful.
Yeah.
Ulrike, yours is a kind of radical rewriting. I mean, from the title to all kinds of effects in the text. I mean, what did you? I mean, what brought you to that? Was it just necessary for the material?
I like when you said, I go with the poem. I think that's very neat. Otherwise, we live on the North and the South Pole. The sonnet writing is on the North Pole. I'm just, an inhabitant of Antarctica. I think probably, I tend to be a very structured and analytical person. So, and I enjoy in my poetry to play around with structures and to invent them along the right. While I write, I breathe. While I write, I talk. And from spoken language, the rhythm evolves, and it's malleable, it metamorphoses. It has to change with the so-called content because it is part of the content. So the hexameter was my kind of starting point, but you wouldn't have heard one, which isn't, you know, a fault of Karen's wonderful translation, which is not only due to that it is in English, to the fact that it's in English, but because I also don't really use it properly. I break it up, I change it. It has all these gaps. It's like breathing, like stops, like traces of trauma, which don't allow you to just keep on speaking as if it was kind of mellifluous flow of rhetoric. It isn't. The poem talks from a different layer, a visceral layer also, a bodily layer. That's where the language comes from. That's where it's really related, it's grounded in your body. So, and then this is about, we didn't hear that because we haven't started yet, but when the book kind of really starts, the ship has left the harbor, so we are on the sea. Here you have a cascade. Yeah, a cascade of rhythms and of interfering rhythms as well, because waves and wind and tide combine and create what makes you sick, but not in the poem. It makes it beautiful. So it's kind of moving along, and I don't have a concept for a single line. It has to develop, but then it became clear while I was writing that the book would really also be about. It's not. The title is right in a way, because it says Penelope's craft. So it is about Penelope, but it's all about all the women who are on the ship. So she starts out as the queen and protagonist, but she doesn't continue to be that, because during the journey, a lot of things happen. Amongst them, order has to be reinvented and hierarchy dissolves. So single women speak up. They find their voices for the first time, perhaps, in their lives, because they've been slaves before. And so there are chapters where Medusa talks, or Antigleia talks, or Charis talks, or someone else. And so they are characters talking, and they have a specific tone to themselves, which sometimes took me a long time to find it. And then, you know, you don't think about hexameter any longer, but you think about how would this imagined person, how would they sound? And there is an end to it where there's a contemporary person called Penny who studies classics in Berlin, and she has the final pages and the final. So yet another tale. It's prose, basically.
Well, I'm very glad a woman gets the last word. So now it's time, I think, to open for some questions. If there are some questions in the audience, or I believe people online are going to send in written questions as well, which will be fed.